Hi everybody, this is Glynn Buchanan from the University of Pretoria. I'm doing the South African parts of our multinational study on the maxillary and mandibular first premolars. Prof. Fatma asked me just to make a short video where we just explain a little bit around how we are evaluating the teeth in the reliability data set. So this doesn't necessarily apply to your own data sets that you'll be looking at individually from each country. But for the reliability data, we've been having some problems with a lot of inconsistencies, and that gives us sort of weak inter and intra-observer reliability scores. So we just wanted to clarify a couple of things, and hopefully this can help everybody in their classification of this part of the study. So the purpose, as I said, is just to provide a little bit of guidance regarding the evaluation of the reliability scans, specifically when using the Ahmed et al. Classification. I'm just going to include some general information to help classify the root number as well as the canal structures of the teeth. And the idea is we want to try to improve the consistency in our reporting and thereby improve the inter-observer reliability scores. So here's just an example of one of the data sheets that we started comparing. And we found that there were sort of a lot of inconsistencies. So we just looked at my scores for one of the tooth types, and then Dr. Gouldane's scores as well. And what we found in our inconsistencies, and this is true for everybody's reliability, is that we're having differences in a couple of things. The main things that I could pick up are differences where we report the level of evaluation of the pulp chamber or where the canals start. And we'll cover that a little bit later in the video. The way that we write our codes, for example, there in number 9, case number 9, the way that we write the codes also has an impact on our reliability as well. And there you can see that we're using different descriptors. So the MP instead of the 1-4, but in reality that classification is actually the same. But it gets reported as something different. And then the third major thing was the reporting of additional features. So if we're adding things in like accessory canals or, for example, root fusions, then we're also finding significant differences there. Even though in many cases, as I say, we are seeing the same thing. So this video is just about really clarifying that. So we know from our Ahmed et al. System that it's an incredibly complex system, and depending on how you use it, you can report things in many different ways. The trouble is that this leads to the creation of a large number of individual categories, and even slight changes in the codes result in us reporting a disagreement where there isn't necessarily one. So classically, it is correct technically to report a superscript number for your roots in front of your descriptor. So the MP is your descriptor, and then your number of orifices, canals, and foramen after that. But the way that we want to do it in this study is the same as the drop-down menus. So where we're not using superscript and where we're not using tooth numbers as the descriptor, but we're using MP because that's indicative of both a maxillary premolar in the one data set and a mandibular premolar in the other data set. So we're using MP as the descriptor, and we're not actually using superscript numbers. We'll go through that in a second. Right, so the first recommendation that we have is regarding root number. So for root number with premolars are always considered single-rooted up until we find that there's a clear separation of that root into 2 or possibly more roots. It can have 3 roots, possibly 4 roots. It's not impossible, but it's considered single-rooted unless there's a clear separation, right? So in the case illustrated in the top of the slide, that is an anterior tooth, but the principle applies as well. If you notice in the coronal third, in the middle third, and the apical third, that there's no split of the roots, that would be considered a single-rooted tooth. Whereas the example in the lower panel indicates a tooth number 2-4, and there you can quite clearly see that there are 2 roots, and we can see that based on our axial slices. In the axial slice in the coronal third, we can see that it's still 1 root, because they're still together, and that's the yellow arrow. But in the blue arrow, we can notice that the roots have already separated. So there's clear separation of those roots, and they remain separated down in the apical third as well, and we can see that in the green arrow. So what's important to note is that if you scroll through your axial sections and you find that the entire root looks like the yellow arrow, that would still be considered a single-rooted tooth, and it's not considered fusion of two roots. That's still just a single-rooted tooth if it looks like the yellow arrow all the way down. I'll provide a slightly better example in a second. So here's a better example. So here's an example of a lower premolar. In this particular case, there is a deep groove on the mesial aspect, but here we can quite clearly see that it's always joined. There's no clear separation of roots there. So even a tooth like this, although it might appear in some views and at times as if it could be two roots that has some type of fusion, this is not a case of fusion, and we're not reporting fusions in the reliability data. Okay, so even if you see something like this, that would still be considered a single root in the Ahmed et al. Classification. The second recommendation pertains to the writing of codes. So we alluded to that in one of the first slides. So what we want to do is we want to use the same format that's presented in the drop-down menus of the data collection sheet when we report codes. So for example, we want to report something as the code in green there. So a number, your tooth descriptor, and then your numbers after that to indicate the canals, orifices, and foramen, right? So we don't want to use a different descriptor, because if we use the tooth number, for example 14 or 24 instead of MP, then it's going to show up as a different code, and it's exactly the same if we use superscript numbers as well. So if we make our numbers superscript, like I said, whilst that is technically the correct thing to do, and that's the way that we're going to write it in the publications, or if you write a thesis or something, you would write it that way. But for the purpose of the Excel spreadsheet, please report the codes as is indicated in green, okay? So non-superscript numbers, and with MP, please, as the descriptor. All right, and the reason for that, as we said, is because on the computer and in the statistical software programs, that will be seen as a disagreement. So in reality, that's the same code. You know, observers are seeing exactly the same anatomy, but it gets picked up as two different codes. Right, the third recommendation is the level of the pulp chamber or the canal. So this comes from Ahmed's elaboration of the system. It's a 2021 paper. I can send a link to anyone who wants to read it. But for single-rooted teeth, you're going to start your classification at around the level of the CEJ, or perhaps just below the CEJ. So that's the example on the left-hand side. If you look at the yellow arrow, in multi-rooted teeth, so if you've got a two-rooted premolar, for example, a 1-4 or a 2-4, then you're going to start your classification from the level of the pulp floor or the bifurcation of the canals. So I've drawn little outlines there in yellow. Please remember that the Ahmed et al. System, it's a root and canal classification system. So we're not classifying the pulp chamber, we're classifying the root and canal structures, and that's considered to start from the level of the orifice, which can be a little bit subjective. We do know that, but those are the recommendations of where to start. And this is important because if we don't classify from the same level, it changes the code that we report. And I'll show you that in the next slide. So here's a good example. So if we were to start our evaluation from the level of the yellow arrow, it's going to change the code, because the first thing that you're going to see is it's going to appear just to be one canal that splits down into two lower down. Whereas if we start at the level of the red arrow, which is the correct position, then we're actually going to see two canals, and those two canals are just going to go down into the two roots. So the level where we start really does make a big difference, and it can have a major impact on the code that we do report. So we want to start at the correct levels here. So I hope this just gives a good indication of where we're starting to classify the root and canal structures, because remember, we want to start from the level of the orifices and not the top of the pulp chamber. The fourth recommendation is the inclusion of additional features. So please do not evaluate accessory canals. Although you can see accessory canals on CBCTs at times, many of them are generally speaking too small to see, and the classification of accessory canals is not the primary objective of the study. It's more applicable in micro-CT studies where we can see more details. So please, for the purposes of the study, don't include accessory canals in your codes or your evaluations. And if you have included them, please remove them because it's just going to make things easier. By that sort of same logic, we also don't want to evaluate root fusions, please. Not for the reliability data. If you do see a true fusion in your data set, you can report it in that data set, but please don't do it for the reliability assessments. Because, yeah, to be honest, I didn't find any root fusions there. But yeah, I mean, we can beg to differ, and that's okay as well. If you really do feel that it's there, I guess you can say so, but please don't report it in the reliability codes. I'm just going to give you a short example as well that just has a couple of tips on how to use the 3D Slicer software. I'll be the first to admit that I'm not an expert on this software. I'm using Remexis from PlanMecca. And that I use for most of my data sets, but I have figured out the 3D Slicer software a little bit. So just an example of one case and just a couple of functions that I found that might be helpful for you to help and evaluate these cases. Hi, everybody. So just to share my screen quickly and just provide an example of a case. So if we're in our 3D Slicer software, right, when we open it up, initially, we're not going to have our annotations on. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to click on the annotations, and then on this little drop-down menu next to it, you can click on interaction. And at that point, you have the ability to actually move your crosshair around. So what you want to do in this particular case, I'm just going to use the 2-4 as an example. You can place it on your 2-4. And what we can do then is we can move the entire volume. So if you use the center mouse button, you can actually move the volume a little bit more to the middle. If you hold your control key in as well, and you zoom in, you can actually get it a little bit larger as well. So in this program, you can't rotate the volume, but you can actually move the little crosshairs and the cursors around a little bit. So if you go towards the end of the block and you get that little hand, you can start to rotate it a little bit, and that'll just bring everything else into view there as well. So if I move down to the coronal section, I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm just going to center my scan using my center mouse button. I'm going to use Control just to zoom in a little bit to make it a little bit larger. Move it back to the front, and I can do the same thing on the sagittal slice. And this just gives you a nice view of the tooth that you're working with. Now you can move these little crosshairs and the little lines, and that just gives you a slightly better view. Right, if you go up to this little piece over here, it's basically a function that allows you to adjust the brightness a little bit and a little bit the contrast in one go. So I like to make my images a little bit darker. It just helps me to see the anatomy. And if you want to go back to just your normal function, just click on the mouse button again. So in this particular case, if you now scroll just with your center mouse button, the scroll button, you can scroll up and down. I find, excuse me, I find that it's easier to evaluate your canal structures on your axial view, right? So we've got a nice view up here, but we can see that we have a problem. And we covered that in the video a little bit earlier. We're too high at this level. If we're going to evaluate from the level of where the red line is now, then we're evaluating the pulp chamber and not the canal structure, right? So we start evaluating the canal structure, as we mentioned, in multi-rooted teeth from about the level of the bifurcation or the level of the pulp floor. So in this case, we need to actually move down a little bit. And in this case, it's sort of close to the level of the creftal bone. We can also find a sort of reliable place to start. And if we pop down there, And if it's easier for you, you can actually take your annotations off. But we can see that we've got clearly two roots there. We can already see that on the coronal view. But in the axial view, we can also see that there's a buccal canal and there's a palatal canal, right? So as I'm going to scroll down the root structure, we can clearly see there's still two canals, two canals, two canals. And there, at that level, the roots actually separate. So we know that the roots are separating in the coronal third of the roots, and we can indicate that as well on our data collection sheets. But as we go down, we can see that there's really just one canal in the buccal, and there's one canal in the palatal roots, right? We'll just scroll down all the way to the end. And if you want, you can just obviously scroll it back. And you can confirm that there are two roots and just a single canal in each root. So that level where they come together again, if you go back to your annotations, you can see that we're at the level of the crestal bone or the bifurcation. And that then is not part of the canal structure anymore. That is part of the pulp chamber. And we're not classifying the pulp chamber, we're classifying the roots and the canal structures. Right, so in this particular case, the classification would be 2MP B1L1. Okay, so it's basically a two-rooted premolar with one buccal root, one lingual root. We call it a lingual root. It is technically a palatal root, but the way that we made the classification on the drop-down menus, it's a lingual root and just a single root on each side with a single canal. Okay, so very, very simple. All right. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. In conclusion, I think what we've come across is that in most instances, we are actually seeing the same anatomy. We're perhaps just reporting it in a different way, and that's leading to some trouble with the reliability data. So in general, there are many more simple teeth than what there are complex teeth. So I think we must try to keep our classifications as simple as possible. But also as consistent as possible, because as we mentioned, only the slightest deviations will result in different codes being reported, and this will be seen as disagreements, and that negatively affects our inter-observer reliability scores. Yeah, I hope this was helpful, guys and girls. It's been fun being part of the study, and yeah, I look forward to keep working with everyone. Cheers.